Hello everyone. As Emma said, my name is Luisa Melloh. I'm a researcher at Climate Outreach. And Climate Outreach is an organization that's been around for about 20 years now, and we are experts in the social science of climate engagement. And yes, we've been working to find out what makes good and effective communication engagement for the past 20 years. Practically, that means that we conduct our own research, but we also provide advice, we give trainings and workshops, and we're also engaged in some advocacy activity on the topic. So I thought we'd do a brief overview of what we actually know about the public's attitudes to climate impact and adaptation at the moment. So the available data shows that the public is becoming increasingly engaged on climate impacts, but that people tend not to think that these will affect them personally. As you can see on this graph here, the percentage of people who say that we're already feeling the effects of climate change has really increased from just 41% in 2010 to 72% just in 2022. And this finding is also supported by this data that you can see here, which shows that 2 in 3 people think that climate change will harm the UK, either a great deal or a moderate amount over the next 5 years. However, what I find interesting about this is another thing that this graph shows us, which is this trend that when it comes to attitudes to climate impacts and adaptation, whilst people recognize that climate impacts are really sort of materializing, they generally expect those to be sort of quite abstract or further away. And as you can see in this graph, the closer the question kind of hits to home, so how much will this affect the world, the UK, your region, or people like you, the less people think that their region and people like themselves will be severely affected by climate impacts. Now, when it comes to adaptation more specifically, the data we have shows that the general public is not yet sufficiently engaged on this topic. This word cloud here was taken from the report on the public dialogue on climate adaptation. This dialogue was held across parts of England and commissioned in 2022, run by Ipsos and the University of Leeds, and I can put a report on that in the chat in a little bit. And the aims of that were to explore the public's views on what a well-adapted England should actually look like and how we might get there. And the findings from this dialogue were intended to kind of feed into and inform the development of NAP3. And as you can see, when you engage people on adaptation, and I'm sure you've kind of seen this in your own work as well, they often are, first of all, shocked by kind of the range, the immediacy, and also the seriousness of climate change risks, and feel that the time to act was either yesterday or is today. And this is also kind of representative, I think, this word cloud of the wider public discourse around adaptation as it stands, which is overwhelmingly negative and often only gains salience around kind of the damage that's being caused by extreme weather events. And we further know from our research and that done by others that when it comes to adaptation, people generally want the government to take responsibility and lead the way. This is also the case for mitigation, but even more so when it comes to adaptation, as people's awareness of and self-efficacy when it comes to adaptive behaviors is often low. And you can see here a quote from one of our focus groups that we ran just in May of this year. And as this participant says, the public expects the government to communicate clearly with them and to suggest solutions for addressing the impacts of climate change. And again, whilst this is also true for mitigation, it's even more important when it comes to adaptation because people themselves are often not the best at assessing their own risk of being impacted by climate change, as we saw earlier. And especially those most vulnerable to climate impacts, including older people and those on lower income, are most in need of the government taking a lead on adaptation and providing an opportunity for these groups to be more engaged and to increase the resilience of these groups. Now then, what do we know about effective climate communication and how does this relate to communicating adaptation? Now, first of all, as humans, we think about and make sense of the world in the form of stories. Throughout history, we've relied on narratives to make meaning of observations and the facts around us. Unfortunately, the current dominant climate story isn't exactly motivating. It's largely portrayed as a science story that's complex and that's remote. But what we need really is a people story, one that's about all of us. Similarly, the news we hear about climate change often suggests that the damage is done, we're all doomed, and it'd be naive to think that we could try and do something about it. However, a motivating narrative is one that doesn't deny the severity of climate change, but one that centers human agency and demonstrates that we all play a part in what happens next. And against this background, great communications around adaptations are those that make it real, that make it normal, and that make it possible. And I'll spend most of the rest of my time to explain what I mean by that. But before doing so, I just wanted to remind us of two key things when it comes to communicating adaptation. One is that generally at Climate Outreach, we understand communication as a two-way process. It's participatory, it's not top-down, it's with and it's for people. And again, I just wanted to remind us that people want to hear from and be involved by their government, especially when it comes to adaptation. We don't find any signs of issue fatigue really, but there's a real appetite for information, for engagement, and for participation. Now, make it real. When extreme weather hits, adaptation often becomes real very quickly, as we know. But as we saw earlier, outside of those really high salience times, people generally think of climate impacts as happening far away and in the far future. But for adaptation action to really take off, we need the types of communications that allow for mature conversation that people can be engaged with in quote unquote normal times as well, in order to build their resilience over time. And one way of doing that is by bringing the risks of climate change home and explaining what they might mean for local communities, for people's neighborhoods, for their well-being in really accessible terms. However, as we know, and we've seen from the talk just now, that these conversations can often sort of trigger quite negative emotions. And these discussions need to prepare for that and properly facilitate those discussions as spaces where these emotions can be given space and used constructively in thinking about with people about what it means for them and the way forward when it comes to adaptive behaviors. Further, people are much more likely to want to engage with an issue if it resonates with their deep-seated values. At Climate Outreach, we follow a values-based approach to communications, and this also underpins our Britain Talks Climate Toolkit, which Emma just mentioned. Because people are not rational beings who kind of dispassionately look at something and weigh up the pros and cons, then to come to a well-considered conclusion. But in fact, we're often much more motivated to act based on our emotions. And that means that you have to show how your adaptation measures or engagement in adaptation are a way of protecting that which people care most about. So the well-being of those most vulnerable, people's health, sort of physically and mentally, and the emergency services kind of running. Like these are generally the three top priorities when it comes to, for people when it comes to what should be prioritized in adaptation. Now, I don't have time to go into Britain Talks Climate or this theory of basic human values, but suffice to say that Schwartz proposed these with his colleagues. These are 10 sort of basic human values that have been found to be more or less universal across cultures and that can be arranged in this circular structure. These 10 values are grouped into 4 higher order categories: self-transcendence, conservation, openness to change, and self-enhancement. And good climate communications tap into and appeal to these various values that people hold, because it's these core values and fundamental worldviews that have the ability to motivate people to take action. And again, I'm happy to kind of discuss some examples of what that might appealing to these different values might look like when we go into the breakout session later. Second of all, great climate communications have to make it real. This is about kind of demystifying adaptation, and many people don't know actually what it means or how it differs from climate mitigation. And normalizing adaptation action is something that people can see themselves and people like them being part of, is really what this is about. So that includes social norms, the idea that as humans we often conform to what we think other people expect us to do, I think we should do, or what we see them do. And so if those around us who identify with take adaptive behaviors or engage with adaptation, then we are also more likely to do that ourselves. In this context, it's important to remember that who's speaking and how they're speaking is as important, and maybe if not more, as what is actually being said. So some of the key actors who have sort of implementing powers when it comes to adaptation measures, and that includes local authorities and organizations like housing associations, can often be not very highly trusted by parts of the population. And especially when it comes to discussing a topic as emotionally charged as adaptation, trusted messengers play a really important role in effectively engaging people. Trusted messengers can be all sorts of people. So this could be a residents association rep, faith leaders, health professionals, essentially anybody that your target audience identifies with, who they listen to, and who's demonstrated that they have that community's best interest at heart. And so when it comes to engaging people on adaptation, that means that sometimes you might actually not be the best messenger for your own message as a local authority. So it's really important to kind of form alliance with local communities and organizations and pass the mic to let others speak about this in an authentic way. And then finally, making it possible. So showing that adaptation is not just this abstract big infrastructure process that's being done to people, but giving people the vision for where this leads and how they can be part of it. And how do you do that? By giving people positive visions of the future, a vision of what their community, what their life could look like in a well-adapted setting. This is not about prescribing a single feature, but about enabling people to envision their own positive futures, plural, which can then be kind of collectively explored and negotiated. And this also relates to my earlier point kind of about the current negative discourse around adaptation, where it only really gets a mention in disaster communication or when climate impacts have already been felt. In order to motivate people to want to engage with adaptation on positive terms, we need to reframe adaptation as a positive, proactive response to climate change risks and impacts that doesn't just sort of hold bad things at bay, but that clears the way for better futures. And a big part of making it possible is also about sharing success stories from other places where adaptation action has been successful. And I think this network is a great way to do that. So this is about inviting both experts, but also ordinary people who've been part of adaptation initiatives and get them to talk about their experiences and kind of serve as inspiration for conversations about what adaptation could look like with your target audience. And then once you've created that vision and shown examples of where things have worked in other places, you need to give people the tools and the means to be part of creating those features. As I mentioned earlier, engaging the public is not about kind of a process of telling them what needs to happen and a way to get them to sign off what you are anyway going to do. But it's about demonstrating to people that adapting climate change is about them, the lives of their loved ones and their communities. And that's why they need to be part of it and why their actions matter. And so then, in summary,
we just ran out of time, Luisa. Sorry, we've got like 30 seconds left, if that's all right.
Yes, I'll just read these out. This is my last slide anyways. Great. So these 5 recommendations are climate impacts are increasingly salient and adaptation policies are supported across the political spectrum. So really lean into this and demonstrate leadership when engaging the public on adaptation. Climate change is getting closer to home, and so show how climate risks are relevant to people's lives by relating them to widely shared values to build efficacy by making the link to constructive solutions and better features. Frame adaptation messages holistically, so concerns about mitigation and adaptation reinforce each other and generally are seen as 2 sides of the same coin. It's important to make the connection between health risks, well-being, and adaptation. So frame it in this way, but don't assume a lot of knowledge there that exists already. And then finally, harness and communicate the transformational potential of locally led adaptation. So good adaptation doesn't just prevent the worst case scenarios, but can actively improve the lives of many. And so follow the principles of a just transition and just resilience in adaptation as well. Thank you.